had blue-grey hair. She smiled. "Yes?" "Mr. Leiter," said Bond.
"Oh, yes," she said. "You're Mr. Bryce. I'll show you to your cottage. Number 1, right down by the sea. Mr. Leiter's been waiting for you."
She looked at Solitaire. "This is Mrs. Bryce," said Bond.
"Oh,"
said the woman.
"I'm Mrs. Stuyvesant."
She took them down a path to a cottage and knocked on the door. Leiter opened it. His mouth fell open in surprise when he saw Bond. "This is my wife," Bond said quickly. "Oh, yes. Hello," said Leiter. He almost pulled the two of them into the cottage, then shut the door before Mrs. Stuyvesant could speak. A small living room looked across the beach to the sea. It had comfortable beach chairs and a large table with a glass top. There was a white telephone and some flowers on the table. Bond and Solitaire sat down, and Bond lit a cigarette. He put the pack on the table. Leiter was still staring at them, his eyes wide with surprise, unable to speak. Suddenly, the telephone rang and Leiter picked it up. "Is that you, Lieutenant?" he said. "Yes. He's here. He's just arrived." He listened for a moment, and then turned to Bond. "Where did you leave the train?" Bond told him. "Jacksonville," Leiter said into the phone. "Yes, I'll get the information from him and phone you later." He put down the telephone and sat down opposite Bond. He looked at Solitaire. "I guess you're Solitaire," he said, and smiled at her. "She's working with us now," Bond told him. "That's great," said Leiter. "Well, you won't have seen the newspapers or heard the radio, so I'll tell you. The Phantom was stopped soon after Jacksonville. Your compartment was bombed, and the bomb killed the train attendant. He was outside in the corridor. The police started asking questions immediately. Who did it? Who are Mr. and Mrs. Bryce? Where are they? Of course, we thought you'd been kidnapped. Then the police found out that your tickets had been bought in New York by the FBI. And after that, everyone wanted answers from me." He reached across for one of Bond's cigarettes. "Now, tell me your story." Bond told him. "Did anyone see you when you left the train at Jacksonville?" asked Leiter. "I don't think so," said Bond. "But we'd better keep Solitaire here until we can get her safely away. We'll put her on a flight to Jamaica tomorrow. I can get someone to look after her there until we come." "Okay," said Leiter. "We'll get a ticket for her to fly to Miami tomorrow. From there she can fly to Jamaica. She should arrive in Jamaica by tomorrow evening." "Is that okay, Solitaire?" asked Bond. Solitaire was staring out of the window. "Yes," she said nervously. "Yes, I suppose that's all right." Chapter 12. Death of a Bird. Solitaire stood up. "I'll take my things to the bedroom," she said. "I expect you two have a lot to talk about." "You can have James's room," said Leiter. "He can share my room." He took her to the bedroom, then went into the kitchen and came back with a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. When the 2 men were holding their drinks, Leiter began to talk about the train. "It left Jacksonville about 5 o'clock, he said. It got to Waldo at about 6, and the bomb exploded soon after it left. Here's what I think happened. Just after the train leaves Waldo, Mr. Big's man gets into the compartment next to yours. He puts some sort of sign in the window, a message to show that your compartment is to the right of it, maybe a towel or something like that. About 20 minutes after leaving Waldo, the train driver gets an emergency signal to stop the train. There's a gray Buick car waiting on the road that runs next to the train track. The train driver sees 3 black men get out. 2 are carrying guns, and the other man has something in his hand. They walk along the train and stop outside car 245. The 2 men with guns shoot out the glass in your compartment window. The other man throws in the bomb. Then all 3 run back to the Buick. They drive away fast. The bomb goes boom! End of James Bond. Except that it's not. Well, that's the 3rd time I've escaped dying since I arrived in New York, said Bond. Mr. Big won't like that at all. He doesn't usually make mistakes, said Leiter. Tell me, what more do you know about the gold coins? Asked Bond. They definitely get into the USA through St. Petersburg, said Leiter. The Tutor comes straight from Jamaica and always stops at that factory. What's it called? Ouroboros, said Bond. Let's go and see the place, said Leiter. The Tutor is in Cuba now. It left St. Petersburg a week ago. They searched the yacht when it came in and when it left, but didn't find anything, of course. No gold coins. But let's go and see if we can have a look at Mr. Big's robber. Go and tell Solitaire to stay here until we get back. Then we'll take her out to dinner. But Solitaire did not want to be left alone. I want to get away from here, she told him with fear in her eyes. Bond kissed her. It's all right, he said. We'll be back in an hour. Nothing can happen to you here. Then I won't leave you until you're on the plane. Leiter had a car waiting outside. Minutes later, Bond was driving the car across the causeway from Treasure Island to the city of St. Petersburg. When they came to the city's waterfront, Leiter said, We'd better get out and walk. The robber's place is near here. They left the car and walked to a narrow street which ended at a small wooden jetty that reached out 20 feet into the sea. Next to the open gate of the jetty was a long, low warehouse. Painted on the wide door were the words, Ouroboros, worm and bait shippers, coral, shells, tropical fish. Inside the big door, there was a smaller door, with a lock on it. The sign on this smaller door said, Private. Keep out. The robber was sitting in a chair outside the small door. He was cleaning a gun. A Remington .30 rifle, Bond thought. He was about 40 years old, with a thin, dark face. He looked cruel and cold, like the bad man in a crime film. Bond and Leiter walked past him and onto the jetty. He did not look up, but Bond could feel the man's eyes following them. They watched a large grey bird, a pelican, flying above the water. Suddenly, it flew down into the water and came back up holding a fish. Moments later, it flew slowly back, landed on the jetty and swallowed the fish. Bond and Leiter turned around and walked back to the robber. He was still cleaning the rifle. "Good afternoon," said Leiter. "Are you the manager here?" "Yeah," said the man without looking up. "Could we leave our boat here?" asked Leiter. "It's too crowded everywhere else." "No," said the man. Leiter took a $20 bill from his pocket and held it out to the robber. "Would this help to change your mind?" "No," said the robber. Then, after a moment, he asked, "What's the name of your boat?" "The Sybil," said Leiter. The robber stared at them. Then he moved the rifle across the front of both Bond and Leiter. They did not move. The robber pointed the rifle down the jetty, narrowed his eyes and pulled the trigger. The Pelican made a small noise, and they heard its heavy body fall into the water. "Why did you do that?" asked Bond angrily. "Practice," said the robber, putting another bullet into the rifle. He stared at them. "You got guns. I can smell them." He moved the rifle so that it pointed at Leiter's stomach. Then he got up and opened the door behind him. "Come around here again, and I'll shoot you, just like the bird. I've had enough of cops like you looking around and asking questions." He went into the warehouse and closed the door with a crash behind him. Bond and Leiter looked at each other. "So we won't be going in the front door," said Bond, smiling. "But every warehouse has more than one door." "We'll check that on our next visit," said Leiter. "We'd better get back to Solitaire." They drove back to the Everglades, where they found Mrs. Stuyvesant waiting outside. She saw them get out of the car and hurried towards them. "There was a large wooden box delivered to your cottage, Mr. Leiter," she said. "Very large. The two men who brought it had trouble getting it through the door. I hope—" Her mouth fell open in surprise as Bond and Leiter turned and ran towards the cottage. Chapter 13. The Man with No Face. Solitaire was not in the cottage, and the lock of her room had been broken. Bond swore angrily to himself. He should not have left her alone. The two men had probably been carrying guns. Bond imagined the fear Solitaire must have felt as they put her in the wooden box. But how had Mr. Big found her so fast? It was just another example of the fact that Mr. Big's spies were everywhere. Leiter was speaking to the FBI on the telephone. When he put the phone down, he said, "They're sending 2 of their men here. I'll talk to Washington and New York." Bond went back into Solitaire's room. Her things were still there, and he found her bag under the bed. He looked inside it and found the $5,000. Bond put them into his pocket. The money would be safe with him. It was 8 o'clock when the FBI men finished their search for clues and left. Bond and Leiter went out and had dinner and some drinks, then went back to their cottage. Much later, after more drinks, they went to bed. Bond slept in Solitaire's room and woke up at 8 o'clock the next day. He had a quick shower and went into Leiter's room. Leiter was not there, but there was a note by the door. "It's 5 o'clock. I'm going to visit the worm and bait warehouse. It's strange that the robber was sitting there with his rifle while Solitaire was being kidnapped. Maybe he knew we were in town and was ready for trouble if things went wrong. If I'm not back by 10, Call the FBI on Tampa 88. Felix. Bond did not wait. He telephoned for a taxi. He got dressed and was just about to leave to go to the warehouse when the telephone rang. He picked it up. "Mr. Bryce? This is Mound Park Hospital speaking," said a voice. "Dr. Roberts here. We have a Mr. Leiter here who is asking for you." "What happened?" asked Bond, full of fear. "Is he all right?" "A car accident, but it's not too serious," said the voice. "Can you come now?" Bond's taxi arrived, and minutes later he was crossing the Treasure Island Causeway. An ambulance went past them. More trouble, thought Bond. A pretty nurse sat at the hospital desk. "Yes?" she said. "Dr. Roberts called me," said Bond. "I'm looking for a patient called Felix Leiter. He was brought in this morning." "There's no doctor called Roberts here," said the nurse. She looked down at a list on the desk. "And there's no patient called Leiter. Are you sure you're at the right hospital?" Bond stared at her, trying to keep calm. Then he turned away without answering. Luckily, there was a taxi outside. Bond told the driver to take him back to the Everglades as fast as possible. When they arrived, Mrs. Stuyvesant hurried out to meet him. "An ambulance came just after you left," she told Bond. "The man said that Mr. Leiter had been in a car accident. They had to carry him into the cottage, and his face was covered with bandages." Bond did not wait to hear more. He ran to the cottage and straight into Leiter's bedroom. There was the shape of a body on Leiter's bed, covered with a sheet. Bond pulled the sheet away from the face. But there was no face. Only something covered tightly in dirty bandages. He pulled the sheet down further. There were more bandages. Then a large bag, covered in blood, which was holding the bottom half of the body. There was a small hole in the bandages, where the person's mouth should have been. Bond moved his face nearer to the bandages. There was a whisper of breath against his cheek. He picked up the telephone by the bed and called Tampa 88. It took several minutes to make them understand what he was telling them. Bond took off some of the bandages round the top of the head. The hair was wet. Bond touched it, then put his finger to his mouth. It tasted of salt. He looked more closely at the hair, and then he knew for sure it was Felix. A police doctor and 2 detectives arrived, and Bond told them everything that he knew. After some time, the police doctor came out from the bedroom. "I think he'll live," he told Bond. "But one arm is gone and half of the left leg. I don't know what did it. An animal? Maybe a shark?" There was a telephone call from an FBI lieutenant. He had been sent to the robber's place after Bond's earlier phone call. The robber and 2 other men had been questioned for an hour. All 3 had alibis for that morning, and there was nothing at the warehouse except tanks of fish, bait, and cases of coral and shells. Leiter's car had been found on the other side of the harbour. Soon after, the police ambulance arrived and left with Leiter and the police doctor. The 2 detectives also left. The telephone rang, and it was Leiter's CIA boss. He asked Bond to move on to Jamaica as soon as possible. "I think there's a flight tomorrow," said Bond. "I'll be on it. Any other news?" "Oh, yes," said the man. "Mr. Big and his girlfriend, Solitaire, left for Havana, Cuba, during the night. They left from a small airfield on a private plane. That's how we missed them. Our man in Cuba reported their arrival. The secretary is still there, too." After the call, Bond thought for several minutes, then found the telephone book. After a minute, he picked up the telephone and spoke to a man at the Eastern Garden Aquarium. "Where could I buy a live shark?" he asked. "The only place I know is Ouroboros Worm and Bait," came the answer. "They've got sharks, big ones, white, tiger, even hammerhead sharks." Bond thanked him. Then he got out his gun and cleaned it, waiting for night to come. Chapter 14. The Robber. At 6 o'clock, Bond paid his bill at the Everglades and left. Leiter's car had been returned, and Bond drove it into the town. He visited a shop and bought several things, then found a restaurant. After dinner, he drove to the harbour and parked the car near the sea. It was a bright, moonlit night, and he walked along by the low sea wall. The wall was about 3 feet wide, and Bond climbed up and walked on top of it. When he got close to the warehouse, he jumped off the wall into the parking space at the back of the building. Above his head, the roof and top part of the south wall of the warehouse were all made of glass. There were open windows up on the roof, but they were too high for Bond to reach. He started working with a glass cutter that he had bought at the shop. While he was working, he looked through the glass into the huge moonlit warehouse. He could see rows and rows of large glass tanks, and above them there was a long metal walkway. There were also shelves of shells and coral. After a quarter of an hour's careful work, Bond took out a large square piece of the glass in front of him. He took off his shoes and pushed them inside his shirt. Then he pulled himself through the hole in the glass and dropped onto one of the shelves of shells. As quietly as he could, he made a space for his feet. A moment later, he was down on the floor. He left his shoes on the shelf, then moved across the floor with a small torch in his hand. He walked slowly past tank after tank of coloured fish. Underneath these were trays of live worms and bait. After a time, he found what he was looking for, the poisonous fish. Here the tanks were smaller, and there was only one fish in each tank. There must have been hundreds of these tanks. On the glass of each one was a sign saying, "Very dangerous," or "Don't touch." He chose a tank which had a scorpion fish in it. Bond knew these did not attack, but they were poisonous when touched. He took out a pocket knife and opened the longest blade. He pulled up his shirt sleeve and put his arm into the tank. He then pushed the knife blade quickly towards the centre of the fish's head. The knife went through it, and Bond carefully removed the fish from the tank. He dropped it onto the floor. Next, he put his hand into the sand at the bottom of the tank. His fingers touched rows of coins in a flat tray. He pulled out a coin and shone his torch on it. It was gold, and it was Spanish. Bond thought for a moment. There had to be 1,000 coins in that one tank, several $1,000s worth, guarded by one poisonous fish. The secretary would carry about 100 tanks, well over $150,000 worth of gold on each journey. Trucks would come for the tanks, and in another place, the fish would be taken out and thrown back into the sea, or perhaps burnt. The water and sand would be taken out, and the gold coins washed and put into bags. Then the bags would go to Mr. Big's men to be sold. All very clever, thought Bond. He dropped the scorpion fish back into the tank. Suddenly, all the lights in the warehouse came on. A voice said, "Don't move. Put your hands in the air." Bond turned and threw himself under the tank. The robber was about 20 yards away, pointing his rifle at him. There was a crack as the robber fired a shot, and the tank above Bond exploded like a bomb. Water poured down, but Bond had rolled into the next passageway. He quickly got up and ran. There was another shot, and a second tank exploded near him. He was now at the end of the warehouse where he had climbed in. The robber was at the other end, 50 yards away, and he was shooting under the tanks at Bond's legs. Bond fired 2 shots from his Beretta as he quickly crossed the central passageway. There was a crash of glass and water, a scream, and then the robber was shooting again. As Bond passed a row of much smaller tanks, he pushed one of them onto the floor. It left a space on the table. He ran to get his shoes, then quickly ran back and jumped up onto the table. There was a moment's silence as Bond hid on the table and put his shoes back on. Then the robber shouted, "Come out, or I'll bomb you out! Drop your gun on the floor and come down the central passageway with your hands up. I won't shoot. We'll have a little talk." "Okay," replied Bond after a moment. "I don't really have a choice." He dropped his Beretta on the floor. Then he took the gold coin from his pocket and held it tight in his injured left hand. He walked slowly along the central passageway with his hands up and stopped halfway up the passage. The robber came towards him. When he was a few yards from Bond, he stopped. "Put your hands up higher!" he shouted. Bond lifted his hands across his face. Between his fingers, he saw the robber move something on the floor with his foot. Suddenly, Bond guessed what had happened to Leiter. But there was no time to think about it now. The robber moved nearer. At that moment, Bond dropped the gold coin from his left hand. The robber looked down, and Bond moved quickly. He reached out with his right foot, and the steel-capped shoe almost kicked the rifle from the man's hands. At the same time, the robber fired the gun, and the bullet went through the glass roof. Bond threw himself at the man's stomach. The robber began to fall backwards, and Bond kicked again with his steel-capped shoe. It hit the robber's knee, and the man screamed with pain and dropped his rifle. As he fell to the ground, a large part of the floor moved and suddenly started to open. The robber almost disappeared down the black opening of a trapdoor. He gave a scream of fear as his fingers caught the edge of the floor. Bond looked down. Behind the robber's terrified face, he could see nothing but blackness. But he heard the sound of water, and guessed that there was a way out to the sea, probably through narrow bars, and he could hear something moving down there. A hammerhead or a tiger shark? "Pull me out!" cried the robber. His eyes were wide with fear. "I'll tell you anything!" "What happened to Solitaire?" asked Bond coldly. "Mr. Big told me to arrange a kidnapping," said the robber. "2 men in Tampa, Butch and the lifer. They'll be at the Oasis bar. Now will you pull me out?" "And the American, Leiter?" asked Bond. "What happened to him?" "He called me early this morning. Told me to come here because the warehouse was on fire. When I got here, he said he wanted to search the place. He had a gun. He just fell through the trapdoor. It was an accident. We pulled him out before he was killed. He'll be okay." Bond looked over at the fingers holding the edge of the floor. He knew that the robber must have got Leiter over the trapdoor, then opened it. He imagined the robber laughing at Felix's half-eaten body. Bond suddenly became very angry, and he kicked the man as hard as he could in the back, twice. The robber screamed as he fell. There was a big splash, and more screams, as he was attacked by something in the water. Bond kicked the trapdoor shut, and there was silence. He picked up the gold coin and his beretta, turned off the lights, and then walked out of the building. Chapter 15. Jamaica. Bond drove towards Tampa and stopped at a bar for a drink. He used the washroom to clean himself. The bandages on his left hand were dirty, and his finger was very painful. He was very tired, but he got back into the car and drove towards the airport. He stopped at the first hotel that looked open and awake. It was 2 o'clock in the morning, and he went straight to bed. He woke up at midday and walked down the road to a cafe for a sandwich and a cup of coffee. Then he went back to his room and wrote a report for the FBI at Tampa. He said nothing in the report about the gold in the poisonous fish tanks. This would be Bond's secret. He did not want Mr. Big to know he had seen the coins. Later, he drove to the airport and left Leiter's car outside for the FBI to collect. Before he got on the plane, he telephoned the hospital in St. Petersburg. Leiter was no better, but no worse. Bond noticed an FBI agent watching him at the airport. He was certain that the agent was there to make sure that Bond got on the plane. They would be glad to see the last of him. Wherever he had gone in America, he had left dead bodies. The plane for Jamaica left at 5 o'clock. The sun was low in the sky as the plane flew round over Tampa Bay and then flew east. Soon they were over Miami. After an early dinner, the plane stopped at Nassau before flying on across Cuba and finally to Jamaica. When Bond arrived at Palisados Airport, Strangways, the chief Secret Service agent for the Caribbean, was there to meet him. He was good-looking, 35 years old, and wore a black patch over one eye. It was nearly 11 o'clock, and the night was quiet and hot. The two men spoke very little until they were sitting outside Strangway's attractive white house. Then the Caribbean agent told Bond about the Jamaican part of the case. "There have always been stories about Bloody Morgan's treasure on the Isle of Surprise," he explained. "It's a small island in the centre of Shark Bay, where Morgan used to keep his ships. They say that when he left here for the last time, in 1683, he hid his treasure somewhere in Jamaica. When he died, the secret of the treasure's hiding place on the island died with him. For 200 years, treasure hunters found nothing. Then, 6 months ago, a New York company bought the island. And a few weeks later, the Secateur came into Shark Bay. The men on the boat started to cut steps into the rocks, up to the top of the island. Then they built several simple, small buildings there. They said that they had come to collect shells and catch tropical fish for the Ouroboros Company. They bought large numbers of fish, shells, and coral from the Shark Bay fishermen. Then for a week there were explosions on the island, and the men on the boat told people that they were making a large fish tank in the ground. The Secateur visited every 2 weeks to collect the fish, shells, and coral. Fishermen were warned to stay away from the island. One fisherman swam across there at night, planning to search for the treasure. He didn't come back, and his body was never found. After that, nobody went near the island again. They were too frightened. It was about that time that I got interested," Strangways continued. "I sent a report to London, and they discovered that the island belonged to Mr. Big. This was about 3 months ago. I was told to find out what was really happening there, So I arranged for the island to be watched, day and night. Nothing suspicious happened. So I got 2 good swimmers to make an underwater visit to the island. They didn't return, and their bodies appeared in different parts of the bay the next day. Or what the sharks had left of the bodies. Terrible. You can imagine how I felt about it. "Where is the Secretary now?" asked Bond. "In Cuba," said Strangways. "It will be here in a week, the CIA tells me." "How many journeys has the boat made?" asked Bond. "About 20, said Strangways. Bond took a moment to think. So Mr. Big had already taken around £1 million in gold out of the island. "I've got you a house at Bow Desert. You can see the island from there," Strangways told Bond. "I've got you a car and a good man to work with you. His name's Quarrel, and he's the best fisherman and swimmer in the Caribbean. You should rest for a week until the Secretary comes in. Then you're going to have to get onto the island. I'll be in Kingston, reporting to London and Washington. They'll want to know everything we do. Is there anything else I can do for you?" "Yes," said Bond. "I need a frogman's suit with a compressed air bottle, a good underwater harpoon gun, and an underwater torch. And all the information you can get me about sharks. Oh yes, and a limpet mine." Chapter 16. Bond Gets Ready. After breakfast the next morning, Strangways introduced Quarrel to Bond. "Good morning, Captain," Quarrel said. He was a man of the sea, and Captain was the highest title he knew. Bond liked him. After they had discussed their plans, the 2 men left in the little car Quarrel had brought with him. Strangways went to get the things that Bond needed for the job ahead. By 10:30, they were travelling down the little road that went to Shark Bay. The bay was C-shaped, and in the centre was the Isle of Surprise. Quarrel pointed towards the little buildings on the top of the island. There were trees all around them, and Bond looked at them carefully through Quarrel's binoculars. He looked at the place in the bay where the Secretary would anchor when it arrived. Then Quarrel pointed to Bow Desert, in the middle of the western side of the sea. "That's where we'll work from," he said. They drove back onto the main coast road and stopped for lunch on the other side of the wide bay. Then they drove to the western end of the island, to the most beautiful beach Bond had ever seen. There was white sand reaching down to the sea and small fishermen's cottages with palm trees all around them. This was where they were going to stay for the week before going to Bow Desert. Bond went for a swim, while Quarrel went into the cottage and made it comfortable. Later, when the stars and the moon shone down, the sound of the sea died to a whisper. There was the short silence between the 2 great winds of Jamaica. Then the palm trees began to whisper again. "The Undertaker's wind," Quarrel told Bond. "It blows the bad air out of the island at night from 6 until 6. Then every morning the doctor's wind comes and blows the sweet air in from the sea. Well, that's what we call them in Jamaica." He grinned at Bond. "I guess you and the Undertaker's wind have got the same job, Captain." Bond laughed. The next day Bond began his training. Every morning before breakfast, he swam a mile up the beach and then ran back along the sand. At about 9 o'clock, he and Quarrel would go out in a canoe. The single sail took them fast through the water, up the coast to Bloody Bay and Orange Bay. Here they pulled the canoe up onto the beach and then went underwater hunting. Bond used a mask and an old harpoon gun. "Fish don't usually attack a man," Quarrel told him, "except the barracuda, a big, dangerous fish with very sharp teeth. By the end of the week, Bond could swim 2 miles without feeling tired. His hand was completely better, and he was sunburnt. Quarrel was pleased with him. "You're ready for a surprise, Captain," he said. In the evening of the 8th day, they came back to the cottage to find Strangways waiting for them. He had good news for them. Felix Leiter had lost an arm and a leg, but he would not die. "He says that he's sorry not to be with you," Strangways told Bond. "Also, the Secretary sails tomorrow for Surprise, and should be here before dark. Mr. Big is on board. Oh, and a girl called Solitaire is with him. Do you know anything about her?" "Not much," Bond said. "But I'd like to get her away from him. She's not one of his team." He went outside and looked up at the stars. There was a lot to think about, and a lot to do. Discovering the secret of the treasure, killing a dangerous criminal, and rescuing Solitaire. After dinner, Strangways gave Bond several books about sharks and dangerous fish, and then left the cottage. At 6 the next morning, Bond and Quarrel left for Bow Desert. They were there by 10:30. There was a path between the trees that went down to the little beach house. From inside the house, Bond looked across at the island. The top half was hidden by trees, but the cliff looked grey and dangerous in the half-shadow made by the hot sun. After lunch, Bond looked at the things that had come from London. Strangways had sent them on from Kingston. Bond put on the black frogman's suit. It fitted him perfectly. He checked the air bottle, the harpoon gun, dagger and torch. Finally, there was the heavy limpet mine with some fuses. These were in a box with the word "Danger" printed on top of it. At 5 o'clock, Strangways arrived with news of the Secretary. "They've come through Port Maria, and will be here soon," he said. "Mr. Big has a passport in the name of Gallia. The girl's passport is in the name of Simone Luttrell. There are more than 100 empty fish tanks on board." "I'll go to the island tomorrow night," Bond told him. Quarrel came in from outside. "The Secretary is coming in through the coral reef now, Captain." They went a little nearer to the water's edge and looked at the boat through binoculars. It was a good-looking yacht, about 70 foot long, black and grey and built for speed. On the island, 3 men came running down the cliff steps to the jetty. They caught the ropes, which were thrown from the boat as it dropped its anchor into the deep water. Mr. Big stepped onto the jetty, then started to climb the steps. 2 men were carrying a stretcher, and they followed Mr. Big up the steps. There was a woman's body tied to the stretcher. Bond could see Solitaire's black hair through his binoculars. Then 12 men made a line up the steps and handed the empty fish tanks up one after another. Quarrel counted 120 tanks. After this, tanks half filled with water and sand were carefully passed down to the boat, one every 5 minutes. "They're putting things on the boat already," Strangways said. "That's unusual. Maybe they're all leaving the island in the morning. This could be the last trip." Bond and Strangways walked back up through the trees, leaving Quarrel to watch the yacht. They sat down in the living room, and Strangways got himself a glass of whisky. Bond stared out of the window, thinking. It was 6 o'clock. The moon was already in the sky, and the undertaker's wind blew softly through the palm trees. He had travelled 2,000 miles for this, but suddenly he hated and feared the sea, and everything in it. And in a few hours he would walk alone under that black sheet of water. Quarrel came in soon after. "They're working with lights now, Captain," he said. "A tank every 5 minutes. I guess that'll be 10 hours' work." They'll finish at about 4 in the morning, but won't sail before 6. It would be too dangerous to leave earlier. It needs to be light for them to find their way through the coral reef. I'll start at 10 o'clock tonight, said Bond. I'll go from the rocks at the left of the beach. Can you get us some dinner and then get the things I need out onto the beach? Quarrel left the room, and Bond turned to Strangways. Now, tell me what they usually do when they're ready to sail, he said. How long does it take them to get away from the island? If it's the last trip, they'll leave with extra men. Listening carefully to Strangways, Bond suddenly felt strong again, and his fear disappeared. They talked for the next 3 hours. At 10 o'clock, Bond was on the beach and dressed in his black frogman suit. Quarrel and Strangways watched him go slowly into the sea and vanish under the water. Go safely, said Quarrel quietly. Then he and Strangways moved back through the bright moonlight and the shadows to the house to wait for Bond's return. Chapter 17. Food for the Barracudas. The heavy limpet mine was tied to Bond's chest and carried him straight to the bottom of the sea. He was carrying the harpoon gun in his left hand, but he travelled fast through the water. He was warm in the frogman suit and breathed easily with the help of the compressed air. It took him 15 minutes to swim through 50 yards of the dangerously sharp coral reef, which was full of all sorts of sea life. He stopped and rested for a short time at the edge of the reef. Suddenly, he felt something moving tightly around both of his legs. It was an octopus. Bond tried to swim away, but the octopus was stronger than he had expected. In a moment, he would be pulled down flat onto his face. Then it might be impossible to fight the octopus with the heavy mine on his chest and the air bottle on his back. Bond quickly pulled the dagger from his belt and tried to attack the octopus between his legs. But then he was turned over onto his back and was lying on the sand. At that moment, he remembered the harpoon gun and reached for it. He pulled the trigger. Immediately, a thick black cloud came from the octopus's body. One of Bond's legs came free, and then the other. He pulled hard on the harpoon line, and another black cloud poured towards him. The harpoon was free. Bond was breathing heavily. Above him, a stream of air bubbles went up to the surface of the water. Bond swore, afraid that they might be seen from the yacht. But there was nothing he could do. He swam forwards. There were shadows of big fish on the moonlit sand, some as long as himself. One shadow followed beside him, and he looked up to see a shark. Its nose was following Bond's line of air bubbles. After about a minute, it moved away. Then there were large barracudas moving above him and looking down out of their angry eyes. They were interested in him and his bubbles, and followed him silently. There were about 20 of them by the time Bond was near the island. Suddenly, Bond could see the bottom of the secateurs above him. He looked at his watch. It was 3 minutes past 11 o'clock. He took a 7-hour fuse from his side pocket and pushed it into the limpet mine. The rest of the fuses he buried in the sand. He did not want them to be found if he was caught. After this, he swam up, carrying the mine between his hands. He fixed it as carefully as he could to the bottom of the secateurs and turned to swim towards some rocks. Then he saw what was happening behind him. The barracudas seemed to be going crazy. They were swimming round in circles like mad dogs, and 3 sharks were moving quickly between them in the water. Bond was hit in the face and knocked again and again, At any moment, his rubber suit would be torn, and his skin broken and bleeding. Then the barracudas would smell the blood and be attacking him in seconds. He swam fast along the bottom of the boat, with his harpoon gun ready. Suddenly, the sea above him turned red. Pieces of something floated down towards him. He caught a piece and looked at it. Up above, someone was throwing dead fish and pouring blood into the water. Now Bond understood why there were so many barracudas and sharks around the island. Mr. Big was feeding them. They were his protection against people who wanted to have a look around, 3 of whom had already been half-eaten by the fish. Something hit Bond hard on his left shoulder, and a large barracuda swam away with a piece of black rubber in its mouth. Bond felt no pain as he swam wildly towards the rocks, but blood was coming from his shoulder, and water was starting to come in between the rubber frogman's suit and his skin. He was just about to swim up to the water's surface when he saw a wide hole in the rocks in front of him. A large rock lay on its side next to it, and Bond swam behind the rock. He turned in time to see the barracuda coming towards him again. He fired the harpoon gun and hit the fish in the center of its open mouth. The fish stopped and tried to close its mouth. Then it swam away, taking the gun, the line, and harpoon with it. Now Bond saw the cave that the large rock had been hiding. He swam through the opening for several yards, then stood up on soft sand. He shone his torch on the sides and ceiling of the cave. He guessed that it had been dug outwards from somewhere in the center of the island, probably by Bloody Morgan's men. The big rock had been there to cover the entrance. The Shark Bay fishermen, who had disappeared 6 months ago, must have found it. Perhaps a bad storm had moved it. Then the fishermen had found the treasure and had gone to Mr. Big for help selling it. That had been a big mistake. Bond guessed that the fishermen had been killed and thrown into the Harlem River. Bond guessed that his air bubbles had been seen, but he had to go on. He had to stop Solitaire getting on the boat. He looked at his watch. 1/2 an hour after midnight. He felt the Beretta under his rubber suit. Had it been damaged by water? He moved on into the cave, shining the torch in front of him. After about 10 yards, there was a small light in the water ahead of him. He switched off the torch and moved towards it. There was a wide, shining pool beyond the end of the cave. Its white, sandy bottom was as bright as day. Bond stopped near the edge of the pool, in the shadows. He tried to think. Suddenly, he saw a thin stream of his blood moving into the pool from his shoulder. He had forgotten the injury from the barracuda, but now it began to hurt. Suddenly, there was a big splash from the pool, and 2 men were swimming towards him with knives in their hands. Before Bond could reach his own knife, they had pulled him up to the surface of the pool and out onto flat sand. His rubber suit was pulled off him, leaving him in swimming shorts. Bond looked up and saw Mr. Big sitting behind a small table. He had a pen in one hand, and there were papers on the table. He looked calm and bored.
"Good morning, Mr. Bond," he said. "You took a long time coming. We saw your air bubbles some time ago."
Bond was in a cave as big as a church. The pool covered half the floor. Then there was the narrow bit of sand he was standing on, and the rest of the floor was smooth, flat rock. Some steps went up behind Mr. Big, and there were bright lights on the walls. A group of men stood to Bond's left, watching him. There were hundreds of gold coins round their feet, and rows of wooden trays beside them. Some trays were on the floor and partly filled with coins. A man had stopped at the bottom of the steps. He was carrying a full tray of coins. In the left corner of the cave, two men stood next to a large metal pot. The pot was hanging over a fire. Beside it were gold cups, plates, and other things made of gold. Along the wall near them were rows of metal trays, each one filled with flat, bright gold. Mr. Big got up slowly from the table and walked over to the steps in the rock. He started to climb.
"Bring Mr. Bond up," he said.
Chapter 18. Death at Sea. They climbed up the steps, past an open door near the ceiling. Mr. Big stopped to rest for a moment. Then up they went again. Bond counted more than 80 steps before they reached the top, where there was a metal door. Mr. Big unlocked the door and opened it, and Bond and his guard followed him through into a long, narrow room. There were metal shackles low down in the walls. A light hung down from the roof at the far end. There was someone lying under it, under a blanket.
"Solitaire," said Mr. Big softly.
Bond started to move forward, but the guard moved quickly and stopped him. Then Mr. Big turned round. He had a small gun in his hand. He pointed it at Bond.
"You can let him go,"
Mr. Big told Bond's guard. Bond went past Mr. Big. Solitaire was on her feet and moving towards him. She saw his face and began to run. "James!" she cried. "James!" They held each other.
"Get me some rope," said Mr. Big.
"It's all right, Solitaire," said Bond. But he knew that everything was not all right. "I'm here now." Solitaire was very pale, and there were black circles under her eyes. She wore a dirty white suit and looked thin. She saw the blood on his shoulder and down his arm. "Oh, my darling, what is it?" she said and started to cry.
"Tie them up,"
said Mr. Big. The black guard came towards them with rope in his hands. For a second or two, Bond thought about attacking him.
"No, Mr. Bond,"
Mr. Big said simply. The guard tied Bond's arms behind his back.
"Over there,"
said Mr. Big. He pointed at one of the shackles. The guard knocked Bond's legs from under him, and Bond fell onto his injured shoulder. The guard pulled him across to the shackle, then put the rope through the shackle and down to Bond's legs. He tied them together. Then he walked back to Solitaire and tied her to a shackle opposite Bond. Mr. Big looked at his watch.
"Go,"
he told the guard. He closed the big door behind the man, then turned to Bond.
"4 of my men have died because of you. My people are beginning to question my power, so something must be done. What happened to the American was not enough, so you and the girl can die together."
He looked at his watch again.
"In 2.5 hours, at 6 o'clock, you will be tied together. Then you'll be pulled through the sea behind the yacht when it leaves. The coral reef will cut you into pieces, and the sharks will smell the blood. They'll finish the job for me."
Bond looked at him. "You're a big mass. That death will come very fast. Big and terrible death. If you kill us, that death will come very fast. I've arranged for it to happen." His mind was working fast when he spoke. He was thinking of the timed fuse in the limpet mine and counting hours and minutes. But would he and Solitaire be dead before that time came? He smiled at her, but she did not seem to see him. Suddenly she shouted, "I don't know! I can't see! It's so near, so close! There is much death, but—"
"Solitaire!" shouted Bond. "Stop!"
He was afraid that the strange things she saw in the future might give a warning to Mr. Big. She looked strangely back at Bond, but said nothing.
"Nothing you have arranged can hurt me, Mr. Bond,"
said Mr. Big. He stood in the doorway and looked at them.
"I'll leave you now. A short but very good night to you both."
It was not yet light when the guards came for Bond and Solitaire. Their leg ropes were cut, and they were taken up to the open ground above. They stood by some trees, and Bond breathed in the cool morning air. As they stood waiting, they saw men walking past carrying things. Everyone was leaving the island. Bond moved nearer to Solitaire. After Mr. Big had left them, he had told her about the limpet mine. It would explode a few minutes after 6 o'clock, so it was important that the Secateur sailed at 6. If they were still on the jetty beside the boat, they would be killed with Mr. Big. Bond guessed that they would be pulled along at least 70 yards behind the yacht. The Secateur would go through the reef before them. With luck, the mine would explode before he and Solitaire reached the reef and were cut to pieces. But would they be killed by the explosion? They had talked all night and held each other. "Don't worry about me," Solitaire had told him. "I'm not afraid, although there is much death very close. Do you love me a little?" "Yes," Bond had told her. "I do." It was getting lighter now, and Bond could hear the sound of the boat's engines. Mr. Big appeared with a briefcase in his hand. He looked up at the sky and said in a loud voice,
"Thank you, Bloody Morgan. We'll spend your treasure well."
He turned towards the guards, who were staring at him.
"Is everything on the boat?"
he asked.
"Yes, sir,"
replied one of the men.
"Then take them down,"
Mr. Big said. The guards took Bond and Solitaire to the edge of the cliff and down the steps. Mr. Big followed them. There were 2 men on the jetty, standing next to the yacht's ropes.
"Tie something round Mr. Bond's shoulder. I don't want any blood in the water yet,"
Mr. Big told Bond's guards. One of the guards cut some of Solitaire's skirt off and used it for Bond's shoulder. He cut their hands free, then pushed them together, face to face. Their arms were put round each other, and then they were both tied tightly together. One end of some of the rope on the jetty was tied to the back of the Secateur. The other end was tied to Solitaire and Bond. For a moment, Bond could see Mr. Big's watch. It was 5 minutes to 6. Mr. Big looked at them.
"Their legs can stay free,"
he said, and he stepped onto the yacht. He went to the back of the boat and sat where he would be able to see Bond and Solitaire. The 2 guards went on board. The 2 men on the jetty untied the yacht's ropes and followed. Moments later, the Secateur moved away from the island. "Look out!" said Bond, as he saw the rope disappearing fast into the water. Bond and Solitaire were suddenly pulled off the jetty and into the sea. For a second, they both went under the water, and then they were up again. The water was rushing past them, and they were pulled through the waves. "Breathe! Breathe!" shouted Bond. "Put your legs between mine!" After a time, the boat's speed dropped as the Secateur moved slowly through the reef. Suddenly, Bond felt the rope tighten again. "Breathe, Solitaire! Breathe!" he shouted, as they started to speed through the water once more. It must be after 6 o'clock now. What had happened to the mine? They were only about 30 yards from the reef now. Now 20. 10. Suddenly, the breath was knocked from his body. Solitaire and Bond went right up out of the sea before falling back again. The sky lit up with the huge explosion. They stopped moving through the waves, and Bond felt the heavy rope pulling them under the water. He pushed hard with his legs, and they came to the surface. Solitaire's head was on his shoulder, and her eyes were shut. The reef had protected them from the explosion, but now the sea was pulling them towards it. Suddenly, Bond felt the sharp coral against the back of his legs and arms. There was something sharp under his feet, and he pushed against it. His feet were on the coral, and then he felt the pain of a rock pushing into his back. He rested for a minute. Solitaire was breathing thinly. There was blood in the water around him, but he guessed that the big fish would not come into the sharp reef. He looked out to sea. The Tutor was gone, and a great cloud of smoke was blowing towards the land. There were pieces of the boat all over the water. He saw dead fish and parts of men's bodies. Bond saw the head of a huge fish come out of the water. It dived down onto something. There was a long and terrible scream. Then two black arms suddenly went up into the air and disappeared again. Two men started to swim towards the reef. One stopped, his hands splashing the water wildly before they disappeared under the surface. He began to scream as he was attacked under the water. The other man was getting nearer to Bond and Solitaire. Bond saw a large head with blood pouring down over its face. It was Mr. Big. His eyes were wide open and staring madly as he swam towards Bond. Suddenly, he gave a scream of pain, and his head went under the water and came up again. There was a cloud of dark blood in the sea around him. Two large black shadows moved out of the cloud, then raced back again. Half of Mr. Big's left arm came out of the water. It had no hand on it, but the great head was still alive and screaming. The head went under once more. When it came to the surface again, its mouth was closed. The yellow eyes still seemed to look at Bond, but they were dead eyes. Then the shark's head came up, and its open mouth came down on the head. There was a horrible crunch. Then both head and shark went under the water for the last time. There was silence. Bond went on staring at the blood-red water for several seconds. Then Solitaire made a small noise, and there was a shout from behind him. Bond turned and saw canoes coming towards him, and Quarrel was in the front canoe, yards ahead of the rest. For the first time since his childhood, Bond felt tears come into his blue-grey eyes. They were tears of happiness and relief. He looked across at the soft green hills of Jamaica. A fresh, northeasterly wind had started to blow, and the sun was beginning to shine down on the water. Life was suddenly very good. Chapter 19. A Holiday for Two. Quarrel brought them to the little beach at Bow Desert, and Bond half-carried Solitaire to the house. After they had had baths and cleaned themselves, Quarrel took Bond to the hospital at Port Maria. The doctors worked on his shoulder, then Quarrel brought him back to the house. Bond was tired and covered in bandages. Another doctor had visited Solitaire, who'd been cut by the coral, but was not badly hurt. Some new clothes would be brought for her from Kingston the next day. There were police on the Isle of Surprise now. Strangways had gone straight to them and told them what had happened. The Secretary, or what was left of her, was at the bottom of the sea in the bay, and police divers were on their way from Kingston. News reporters had heard about the explosion, and there was now a police guard at Bow Desert to keep them away. A full report was sent to M and to Washington. The information would be enough to arrest Mr. Big's men in Harlem and St. Petersburg for gold smuggling. Strangways arrived back from Kingston soon after Bond returned from the hospital. He had a message from M. It read, "Have you put in a claim for us for the treasure? Please do. Well done. Take 2 weeks' holiday." "I put in a claim at Government House for you," said Strangways. "But the British and American governments will both want the treasure." They talked some more. Then Strangways left. The evening was cool after the hot day. Solitaire came out of the house and walked across the grass. She was not wearing any shoes, and was carrying a tray with 2 glasses. She put it down on the garden table near Bond's chair. "I hope they're okay," she said. "I've never made a martini before." Bond looked up at her. She was wearing a pair of his white silk pyjamas. She kissed him, then sat down on the warm grass and put her head against his knee. "You look wonderful," Bond told her. They sat for a while, looking out between the trees as the sunlight started to disappear. There was a crash of broken dishes from the kitchen at the back of the house. Then there was the sound of Quarrel shouting at someone. "Poor Quarrel," said Solitaire. "He's borrowed the best cook in the village and is making us a special dinner, but it's supposed to be a surprise for us." After they had eaten dinner, Bond told Solitaire about M's message. 2 weeks' holiday will be wonderful, but I'm badly hurt. I'll also need someone special who can look after me and help me to get better. Do you know of anyone?" he asked and grinned at her. There was love in Solitaire's eyes as she looked up at him and smiled. "Well, I haven't got any other plans for the next 2 weeks," she said.